So it's my pleasure to present the next speaker, Mike Vendrill. Our history goes back to almost 2 decades. Mike has worked for many different companies who are involved in MEAC, and I was astonished about a little more than a decade ago when he asked me to come and talk about my MEAC experience and options and outcomes. So I told him, Mike, but you know that I'm not using a system that you're familiar with. It is from another company, and that's something that I definitely have to mention. And he told me, I don't care which company it is. We are speaking about philosophy, a strategy, and if we sell that philosophy and the strategy, everybody will gain from that. And I found that very, very impressive, and it's an honor to introduce him, and I hope that you will give us some more insight.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Ashraf. I do want to thank everybody for giving me the opportunity here to talk about an engineering, or let's say maybe a company perspective on how this is developed. And over the last 20 years, I've been directly involved with with MEAC and the development of the technology, the disposables, and everything else. I am the vice president and general manager of a new startup company that's based in Mirandola called CBM Life Motion. We are specializing in ECMO technology that I'll talk about a little bit tomorrow, but I do feel like that's a fair disclosure in the sense that, where's the remote? There it is. In the sense that I also do want to disclose that I have worked for and been fired from a number of companies over the last 4 years, or let's say the last 30 years. I've worked with Medtronic twice as a research and development engineer, and more recently I had the opportunity to be the business director. When we talked about, I was just thinking about mentorship and how important that is, and how important even having a cardiac surgeon in the team that acts as a mentor to encourage exactly what Professor Froms was talking about. With Professor Bacall, I do remember being in the operating theater very early on in my engineering career when we're talking about designing medical devices. And at that time, I was with Dideko. So Dideko became LivaNova, actually became Sorin Group, then became Sorin, and then became LivaNova. But having this perspective, I do want you guys to kind of understand this perspective is not just coming from my recent experience with Medtronic, but it really is coming from the days I started with Shiley, right? When Shiley was making bubble oxygenators. The days that I was working at Medtronic Cardiopulmonary in California and Sorin in California before I moved over to Italy in '99. Worked as an engineer for about 6 years before I took over the mini bypass product line, basically because the Italian guys basically said, you know what, you're the only one that understands it, so knock yourself out. And that's kind of how I broke into being in the business side of it. When, as I'm presenting this, I think one thing that I would also suggest is keep in mind that at this time, so I'm going to start in the 1980s, jump to the 90s, and then start with MEAC. Keep in mind that at this time, there were probably about 23 to 24 different manufacturers making oxygenators at this time, okay? There was a plethora of companies out there, and they were all kind of competing and trying to leapfrog one another to try and come out with the best technology. When I first came into this, the focus, to be honest, for cardiac surgery was survival. And survival on our end as engineers meant making sure that the oxygenators didn't leak. When Savada, I'm thinking about this when we did the Fusion, when we did the Fusion launch for Medtronic, Savada's question to me was, Mike, what do I have to be prepared for? And I told him about how when we used to go and do oxygenator designs for the first time, we would always bring bone wax with us, right? And the bone wax was basically in case the thing started leaking, we'd at least be able to finish the trial, because you just never knew with devices that were new. And I remember I was expecting him to say, where do I get bone wax? And he just looked at me and said, what's bone wax? So that shows you how far we've come. With the bubble oxygenators, though, that was something that I first started on at Shiley. Then the fiber oxygenator started coming out. And why? Because with bubblers, we understand that now, but at the time, people didn't really understand that or didn't appreciate that there could be new technology out there that could limit the exposure to microbubbles. I mean, just think about the fact that we were effectively creating a fish tank of bubbles inside the blood and then defoaming it after we created this massive amount of foam, right? And think about just all the stuff that we used to hear about all that time. Most of you are too young to remember this, but I think John will remember it. Just a pump head, there was a phenomenon where you'd have a lot of microbubbles in circulation. People would wake up delirious and they'd have to knock them back out again. ICU stays were measured in weeks, not days. The big advent that really, the big breakthrough that started coming was when these companies started developing silicone sheet and then PFE sheets, as well as the polyethylene fiber that we now know today is the stuff that Mitsubishi developed, the stuff that's that Membrana at the time, that's now 3M, had developed. And other things too happened at that time, right? Baxter does a lot of stuff, and give them some credit, because they were the ones with Bentley that came out with the first heparin coating. And that started also teaching us about the benefits of being able to have coating, even using albumin and prime to try and create a more biological surface. But when we get to the 90s, and this is kind of when, sort of my heyday in terms of being an engineer, at that time, there were a lot of things that were coming out, like custom sets, custom packs. Most of you guys are not old enough to remember. They used to do that in the hospitals. We used to sell them non-sterile components. They would put our sterile components, and they would have a room where they put all these things together right before they went on bypass. Now we're doing it with custom packs that are pre-assembled. That's kind of why arterial filters were there, because when they were putting all these pieces together, a lot of times when you're putting tubing together, you'd be shaving, depending on the quality of the tubing, you would literally be shaving parts of plastic off as you were putting the connectors in. Centrifugal pumps came out, right? And that was a big one. I mean, that's really the groundbreaking thing with Biomedicus. And when they first came out with the biopump, that really did change not only how people thought about doing bypass, but long run times, and more importantly, about long-term support. That was really kind of a thing to be able to say, we could be using something other than roller pumps and bladders that would just be a kill switch when you're on ECMO. But it started making venous drainage using kinetic assist, something that's very common in Belgium and the Netherlands and northern Germany still. It made that very, very, very applicable. Two other key things that also came out at that time were that people forget that the reason why the DLP cannula catalog is so big is because that actually started as a custom cannula business. They would be able to basically tell any customer or any clinician could send a drawing of the cannula that they wanted, and DLP could actually make that on the spot for them, sterilize it, and get it back to them within 8 weeks, right? So having that customization also started allowing us to kind of focus on pediatrics more. Dudayco came out with the very first pediatric dedicated oxygenator with the LilyPut around 1988, and it became more commercially available through the early 1990s. Now, again, remember, as we're going through all these slides, we're talking about reduction in the number of companies that are doing this. By the mid-1990s, that number that was at about 26, 27 manufacturers in the 80s had dwindled down to less than 16. So now we start getting into, okay, well, how did this whole thing with MEAC, when that hit, there were two things that happened. There were two things that were groundbreaking that really did disrupt how we were doing product development within the perfusion community. The hard shell reservoir had been invented as a kind of a consequence of the way bubble oxygenators were set up. Kobe Cardiovascular developed their first sheet oxygenator, a multi-sheet oxygenator that would work with a reservoir and a kill switch on their heart-lung machine that was the level sensor. Well, what that meant was that instantly the perfusionist became a person that had to sit there and just kind of focus on managing the gas flows with the bubble oxygenators, which were far more sensitive and more difficult to manage. It basically created this whole level of productivity that would allow for perfusionists to start managing things like cell savers, to start looking at doing things with blood cardioplasia, because they would have time to be able to do it. And when the reservoir came out with the level sensor built in, that basically changed everything. And it was the single worst thing that we as engineers ever gave you guys, because it's the most non-biological part of the entire circuit, but it's the easiest thing to learn, and it's the easiest thing to use. So when all of this stuff came out with at that time, we were calling it mini bypass. When it came out, we were all internally within the community, we were all expecting something was going to happen. Somebody was going to be coming out with an entirely new technology that happened just like what with the bubblers that turned into the sheet membranes, just like the sheet membranes that turned into open systems with fiber. We were all of us, all the manufacturers, we were all looking for what is that next thing that's going to completely disrupt cardiac surgery. Well, it did disrupt cardiac surgery, at least for the first, let's say the first 7-8 years, in the sense that off pump was still really a threat, in the sense that it was a threat to perfusion. It was a threat because it was being used for everything. Most of the cases at the time were still cabbage, right? Still revascularization. And a lot of what we were trying to do is come up with circuits that could help people that wanted to say, well, look, we can get the patient benefits of off pump, but get the safety of having a patient on pump so that if anything goes wrong, they can just, you know, do a cross clamp and just go on bypass. And that's kind of where everything hit. I cannot really under stress just how important the two things that happened. One was when Professor Fromm's article came out and it started getting a lot of traction at being presented about essentially people saying you can do CABG with an ECMO circuit. That's pretty much what it was. When everybody saw that you could do that, within about, I don't know, I would say within less than a year, another company called Cardiovention came out with a system that was brilliant. It only had a pump built into the oxygenator. Unfortunately, it didn't have a heat exchanger, but it's because they built it for support for beating hearts. That was the original idea. But a very, very bright group of guys in a small town called Braunschweig decided, we're going to use this for mini bypass because this is all we need. We're going to use it for venting. We're going to use it for, we've got a cell saver, so we don't need to worry about aspiration. And I remember one of the guys from Germany that was at Dedeco at the time came into me and said, you're not going to believe what I saw today. I saw it looked like an IV stand with an oxygenator on it, and I saw them do a complete bypass case. And I remember looking at him thinking, bullshit. There's no way that happened. So I went and I actually sat right next to Professor Al-Sawi and watched them do a mini bypass case. And I came home that day completely changed. It was like I got hit with a bolt of lightning. This is the way that we have to change. This is going to be that disruptive thing. And I have felt that way ever since. And it's just a matter of us working as a community to make sure that this revolution continues. Coming back to this, however, literally within a year, every manufacturer had a mini bypass circuit, and every mini bypass manufacturer was clamoring to try and get the attention of the guys in Paris, clamoring to try and get the attention of Professor Lebold in Regensburg and the guys in Braunschweig. It all really did start there, and it was glorious. For that brief period of about 4 or 5 years, we were all trying to leapfrog each other, coming up with better ways of doing venting, coming up with better ways of doing air management, and that's kind of where we sort of lead. And I should say, you know, it wasn't just McKay, it wasn't just us at Dedeco and at Sorin that we were doing all this. Terumo really jumped in fast, and you know, to Terumo's credit, they worked with one of the chief perfusionists in Braunschweig to come up with a RockSafe system, which, to be honest, was probably one of the best ideas that I ever saw get materialized. It was a great combination of what a company that's standing behind this therapy can do when you have a group of people that you're really listening to in terms of implementing something and bringing it to market. So what happened after that was that, you know, we started carrying on this idea of integrated arterial filters. One of the last oxygenators I ever designed actually had that filter built into it. But one of the first oxygenators I designed for Sorin had the filter, the synthesis and synergy had the filter around the outside. That was kind of the first step because we were afraid that if we put the filter inside the bundle, it would scare the hell out of everybody. Nobody would use it. So we said, okay, let's start by getting everything closer. McKay did the same. And then it was we were leapfrogged when the FX came out, and the FX had the filter screen already built in. At that point, we were like, awesome, all the gloves are off. We can start actually putting these filters inside the oxygenator bundles. So Eurosets came out with one. The Inspire came out not too soon thereafter, and that came out right around the same time that Medtronic launched Fusion. And I do apologize if I'm forgetting anybody. But now at this point, we're also talking about heart-lung machines coming out that can actually do mini bypass as well. The Essence, I think there's one here today. The Essence is already incorporating a lot of what we had when we designed the S5, but taking that to another level. Spectrum Medical does have this capability as well, and they've done a really good job of integrating a lot of the automatic air removal systems into the heart-lung machine as well. And again, I forget it, but I apologize if I'm forgetting anybody. But at this point, today, we're down to about roughly 4 major oxygenator manufacturers and 3 that are sort of mid-sized or startups, right? So think about that. Everything that's been happening is that we've been trying to push the innovation curve, and there are less and less manufacturers that have skin in the game. So from an engineering perspective, what really stimulated this? To be honest, it was the number of hospital, or let's say the number of companies that were actually in the business that helped push and try to look. Everybody was looking for, like what I said, we were all looking for what is going to be the next big step after bubblers to, or actually disc oxygenators to bubblers to fiber membrane. The other thing that that really also really did stimulate a lot of this was we went from in cardiac surgery, we went from survival being good enough to really very self-aware conversations about morbidity, not about mortality, right? It's shifted, in my time, it shifted to a conversation about how do these patients do after cardiac surgery? It's not enough to survive, but what is their quality of life afterwards? More importantly, that all you guys have been dealing with patients that are older, that are sicker, they're more complex, which meant that the mini circuits or the MEAC circuits had to be able to handle a lot of that. They had to be more open. So it became a compromise of trying to say, okay, if we're going to be able to do, like a really, really, really messy valve case, all right, then we're going to need a reservoir, but we're still going to try to find a way that's a better way of doing what we're doing. But it just, in terms of what continued to be the hurdles, however, I think the one thing that really, really works against us is the fact that we are there are not enough companies in this business, to be honest. The larger companies are going to be struggling for a while with I don't want to say dedication to this space, but trying to understand what is their role as larger companies in this space. They are going to continue training and education. They're going to continue to promote the therapy. But from my own perspective, I think one of the challenges is going to be, can small companies come in and really force that level of innovation and push the big companies to continue doing it? But I will be very, very blunt and say there's no way that LivaNova designs the Essence without Spectrum Medical showing up. There was nothing there to promote that, to push them to do it, because the S5 is a great machine. But they had to do it because, rightly so, there was a major competitor that jumped in, really, really with a lot of really great features, and really tried to innovate, and really successfully did so. But the biggest challenge I really do think that we have is really not just the limited number of companies that are in this, but the fact that I think, as some people have said, we've all just gotten so used to being okay with what we're doing, right? That it's good enough and that the results are good enough, when we know they can be better, right? The preponderance of clinical evidence that we have, I mean, it's staggering. 10 years ago, the big argument against this whole concept was, we don't have enough studies. And then we'd start with the single center studies that were meaningful. And they'd say, well, they're not multi-center studies, so they're not really that valid. And now, as we sit here today, there's the previous presentation is talking about the amount of clinical evidence that's out there around this project. And, I think what we need, there's still room for one more step. And Professor, you had asked me what is our position in terms of what do we think industry needs to do? The elimination of the blood-air interface still needs to be managed. Use of defoamers, use of just accepting the fact that you'll have foam, and that's the best way to be able to remove air and separate the blood and the bubbles. Keep in mind that the largest single surface area of the entire circuit is still the venous reservoir. Cardiotomy reservoir, venous reservoir, it doesn't matter. And it's not even close. Even when you have an oxygenator with a square surface, a square meter surface area of about 2 square meters, the average cardiotomy alone has close to 4. So you put that in with the venous reservoir, we're talking about at least 6 to 8 square meters of uncoated, or mostly coated, except for the defoamers, which have to be treated with antifoam. These are all parts that cannot be more biological. They can't be, because if for us to coat a defoamer means that the antifoam, the chemical that actually reduces the blood, the bubbles down to blood, you can't put it on. You can't coat it and have antifoam. Right? So it means that the single largest surface area in the entire reservoir and the entire extracorporeal circuit is uncoated. It's coated with silicone, it's antifoam, but it's still a non-biological surface. The way that we look at this is that the room for improvement is really finding ways to be able to handle suction, aspirated, the blood-air interface. We have to find a way to be able to handle that that's different. But when you look at what we've gained, I share this statistic constantly with everybody. We tripled, when I was at Medtronic, we tripled the number of centers that were using centrifugal pumps, because they had the scope of doing mini bypass at some point. And for centers that are 2 or 3 steps removed from being able to do MEAC, you had to start somewhere. So we would start with introduction of cell savers, right? That was a big one. the introduction of, with some of these centers, the incremental steps that so many centers, in the hopes of being able to do something like this, that they have all taken on board, that is not a small number to, that's not a number to discount. And as I left, in my previous job, as I left, half of our customers had a mini bypass configuration of their tubing set, half, right? And the area that I was responsible for was Europe, Middle East, Africa, Canada, and Australia. So it's not a small number. There is definitely still a lot of market interest. The question that we need to pose is, what can we do to improve the training? What do we do to improve traction in countries like China, which was actually Professor Al-Asawi suggested that maybe there's a significant market interest there. And it turns out that, we're partly based in China, so that could be something that we can help with. But more importantly, looking at how do we leverage perfusion services and try to use them as well as a competitive advantage to start pushing into places like the United States and really be able to look at ways of partnering so that they're angling more based on quality of perfusion, angling based on the quality of the patient outcomes as well. And with that, I do thank the group for allowing me this opportunity to talk about the history. But please do kind of keep in mind that I do apologize for any bias. There are a lot of other people that participated in this significantly, especially on with Terumo, with McKay, with Eurosets. My experience had been pretty specific to what I had done at Dideko and what I've done with Medtronic and what I'd done previously with Shiley. So I hope that there was no inherent bias, but I do want you to be aware that it's a little bit unavoidable just given my own personal history. So thank you very much.
So is there any question from the audience?
Can I just raise your hand if you guys have even seen a bubble oxygenator? Okay, yeah, John, I knew it. You'd be the only one. Okay. Man, thanks, dude. You just made me feel really old. Okay, well. Yeah, sure.
Thank you for the great talk. It's always great to hear you speak.
Oh, thanks, man.
Is there a new technology that is being worked on that you know of or can you discuss openly, like beyond polypropylene or polymethylpentene fiber? Is there a new technology that's very early stages that people are thinking about that could progress oxygenator technology?
Yeah, there is. Unfortunately, and to be honest, all of us as manufacturers, we'd all looked at different ideas about. And for those of you who didn't hear the question, that the question in short is: are we always going to be bound to the fibers that we're using currently? Right? Is there anything out there that we could use that might be different? The biggest challenge that we have as manufacturers is how do you reconcile some of the technology that there is. I mean, the biocompatible LCD technology could actually be used for something like this, where you could use the technology that's common to a wristwatch to be able to use that as a membrane for regulation of gas and just change the voltage as an example. Change the voltage so you can change the alignment of the crystals within the LCD. The problem is that technology like that, it's not cost effective compared to what we can make an oxygenator for now, and more importantly, what the healthcare system is willing to bear. So because this technology is so stable, and because this technology on our end has gotten to a point where the scrap rates, our ability to make these things, it's all fairly well understood. Implementing a new technology, the biggest change, to be honest, the biggest challenge is always going to be not can it be replaced, but is it going to be as cost effective for us to build, and is it going to be as cost effective for you guys to buy? Gene therapy, that's what's going to kill us, I promise.
So thank you very much. I think this was a terrific session, and it gives us hope for the future.